Now then, hello folks and welcome back to my video gaming channel Retro Gamer Diaries. The early 1980s were a transformative period for the video game industry, marked by rapid technological advancements and an expanding market for home computers. And whilst our American cousins were focused almost entirely on video game consoles, such as the Atari VCS, us UK gamers were playing games on our home computers such as the BBC Micro, Commodore 64 and of course the ZX Spectrum. And with their affordable prices and cheap cassette based games, they became a popular platform for development. Now for sure, many of my videos have covered many of these well-known big game developers such as Ocean, Imagine, Ultimate the Game, Denton Designs and so on. But today we're going to go back and look at a classic 80s games company called Durell Software Ltd. And though not nearly as prolific as other software houses of the 1980s, Durell Software has certainly developed some great games. Games such as Galaxy 5, Starfighter, Scuba Dive, Harrier Attack, Saboteur and many others. Fat Worm blows a Sparky, does anyone remember that? And you know, as a software company, you could be sure that after spending your hard-earned paper-round money, the Durell game that was clutched in your sweaty mitts was going to be worthy of every penny. Based in Taunton in Somerset, the games produced by Durell were most prominent on the big three companies of the day, you know, the Spectrum, the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad. Although they were not confined to them completely, they also made an Acorn exclusive and dabbled with a release for the C16 Plus 4. However, their early success was on the Tangerine Oric. And while the Oric has not proved to be a runaway success story, Durell done a pretty good job. However, those classics we recall from the heady days of the Spectrum were a long way from the humble beginnings of the company. While we may remember Saboteur with a certain misty-eyed fondness, the people behind Durell didn't start off with the intention of entering the fledgling computer games market. So let's get started by looking at the complete history of Durell Software. Right, so Durell Software was started in February 1983 by Robert White and his wife Veronica. And at this time, Robert was trained to be an art teacher, but after a while he soon realised that this wasn't quite the direction he wanted his life to move forward in. And to that end, he took himself back to college to train for a career in quantity surveying. And after some years, he qualified with a degree and ended up working for Milton Keynes District Hospital, using the computer modelling skills he had attained while studying. Apparently the hospital at the time was undergoing a huge renovation, and since he had a notion about the modelling software and computers in general, his job was to help iron out the details. The hospital model had already seen several architects work on it, and things were a little confusing at first, such as kitchen units being placed on the ceilings. Needless to say, Robert was soon bored and saw an opportunity to start his own business in the newly emerging home computer industry. Armed with a 48K oric and an Epson printer, Robert started to create an assembler and use it to write games. Now I have to say, the oric was one of my first home computers also. I tried to get a ZX Spectrum, but there was just absolutely no supply in the shops, so my mum, she bought me an oric instead, and I have to say, I've got very fond memories of the oric. So let's have a look at some of these early oric games. Okay, first up is Lunar Lander and Asteroids, which is an action game developed and published by Durell Software and released in Europe in 1983. And both of these games were developed by Robert himself. Unlike Asteroids from Arctic Computing, the Durell Software game of the same name is not a clone of the arcade classic. Rather, it's a game in which you must avoid crashing into asteroids for as long as you can without getting killed. Robert coded the game entirely in BASIC, and it was released in 1983, the same year as the Arctic Computing game also. And as I mentioned, the game was released as part of a compilation pack with Lunar Lander. A lunar lander, well, in this game the player must try to land a lunar landing module on the moon, keeping into account fuel, velocity and distance to the surface. And this game is also written entirely in BASIC also. Next up is Galaxy 5, with 5 arcade action games released in 1983 for the oric. Now we've already seen 2 of the games, which is the Lunar Lander and Asteroids, so we don't need to cover that. Okay, so this is Galaxy, which was done by Philip Dirks. This is Astro War, which was also done by Robert White. And then finally, Space Chase, which was done by Duncan Bett. Our next oric game is Starfighter, which was developed by Mike Highfield, and it was published in 1983. Welcome to the game Starfighter. You have just volunteered to capture one of the Federation's most powerful intergalactic starships on a mission to clear the Andromedan galaxy of alien intruders. Before entering the galaxy, you'll have to destroy the aliens, which have infiltrated past the Starfleet's outlying fighters and are now jamming the start gate to Andromeda. To complete the mission, you must wipe out all the aliens in the 9 sectors of the galaxy and then bring your ship safely through the last Stargate back into the war-free zone. You will be protected by powerful but limited energy shields and will have both long-range photon torpedoes and short-range phasers with which to engage the enemy. So let's have a look at the game. Now, as Durell grew, Robert eventually saw the need to take on extra programmers to design the game for different platforms. He advertised locally for programmers, and Mike Richardson and Ron Jeffs joined the fledgling company at the company's attic room in Taunton. Durell then started developing games for various 8-bit computers such as the Oric 1, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, BBC Micro, Acorn Electron and Amstrad CPC. Now, Mike Richardson had half completed the game on the Spectrum when he answered Robert's advertisement. Having left school early, with hardly any paper qualifications to his name, Mike studied chemistry at night school and on day release schemes, collecting an HNC in computer studies on his way to his MSc in chemistry. Now, working as a chemist in an aerosol factory, Mike bought himself a Spectrum and played around with it in his spare time. Robert hired Mike as a freelance programmer as soon as he saw that half-finished game, and insisted Mike should complete it. Released at £5.50, Mike's first game, Jungle Trouble, secured the Game of the Month slot in the Living Guide contained in issue 1 of Crash. So let's have a look at this game. So Jungle Trouble is a platform game restricted to a single scenario that takes place in a jungle environment. To conquer the game, the player has to get home, but to achieve this, he has to travel from the lower right corner to the upper left corner of the screen, overcoming several obstacles that will be put in his way. By their level of difficulty, these obstacles may be compared to independent levels composed inside a single scenario. The number of lives the player has is represented at the lower right corner, and at the left corner, the existing grey apes which will torment him during great part of the game. Firstly, the player will have to cross a series of platforms without getting in the water, either losing his axe or being attacked by a member of the Order Crocodilia. The axe can be acquired at the start when the player leans himself against the right wall of the screen. Only after being successful transporting the axe from one end to the other of the series of platforms, the player will have to manage its use while he knocks the trees down or defends himself against the Great Ape's attack. Because at the first opportunity they will try to steal it from him, and the axe will become permanently more damaged by its use. And when this happens, the player has to be very cautious, because he's now helpless without any kind of weapon to defend himself or attack, and he'll become an easy prey for the apes. Therefore, the process of acquiring an axe has to be repeated. As for the last two obstacles, the player has to firmly pick a liana and safely jump to the other side of a pool of fire. Immediately after, he has to take a big leap by jumping between the extremes of the opening platform, which will continue to do so until it becomes too wide for any kind of jump. When he succeeds, he may calmly touch the upper left wall and finally reach home safe and sound. Now, I have to say, this game, although it's just one screen, it was blooming hard and a little bit frustrating to say the least. Now, the version we were looking at was the ZX Spectrum, but it was also released in the Commodore 64, also in 1983, so let's have a quick look at that as well. Although Mike's first game was Jungle Trouble, it is worth mentioning that that was not the game that he was actually working on at first. That game was actually Harrier Attack, alongside with Ronald Jeffs. Now, although Mike is often credited for doing Harrier Attack, particularly on the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad versions, it is worth mentioning that these were entirely based on the oric version, which was actually written by Ron Jeffs. So let's have a look at Harrier Attack, starting off with the oric version, which was, as I said, was developed by Ronald Jeffs. Right, so the player controls a Sea Harrier fighter, looking sideways onto a right to left scrolling seascape and landscape. The aim of the game is to take off from a carrier, attack ships and land targets, avoid the odd missile and enemy fighter, then land back on the carrier again. Although the game was a work of fiction, it was certainly inspired by the 1982 Falklands War, in which the Sea Harrier had played a major role. Now, there was one interesting little quirk to the game, and that was it was possible to bomb your own ship as you took off from it. And if you did this, when you returned, it would no longer be there, having been presumably sunk. And being unable to land on it, your plane would just continue flying until it ran out of fuel and then crashed. It was impressive that Durell managed to get the size of this game down to just under 9 kilobytes, which allowed for the fast loading time from the cassette. Now, as I mentioned, Mike developed the Harrier Attack for the ZX Spectrum, and then he went on to write the Amstrad version, which only took a couple of weeks to complete. Clever guy. So anyway, let's have a look at those two versions of the game. There was also a Commodore 64 game which was developed by John Parkinson. Again, this game is based on the original code by Ronald Jeffs. So let's have a look at that game too. Harrier Attack was a big hit. In fact, it was their biggest hit. That sold over 250,000 copies, including 100,000 bundled in with the Amstrad CPC. With Richardson and Jeffs producing brilliant versions of Harrier Attack on the ZX Spectrum and Oric respectively, Durell was quickly established as a serious player. Okay, next up is Scuba Dive, which was released in 1983. Now, there were three completely different versions of this game. The first one we're looking at is the ZX Spectrum version by Mike Richardson. So, in this game, you take on the role of a fearless pearl diver as you plunge into the unknown ocean depths. You'll be swimming with sharks, squid, jellyfish and all manner of strange and deadly creatures. And when you find a clam, wait for its shell to open, then swoop down and grab the prize. And you'll have to descend further to find larger clams and bigger pearls. And if you go deeper still, you may find cave systems with ancient treasures to be taken. Well, that is if your oxygen holds out and if you can get past the waving tentacles of the octopuses which guard these forbidden places. Once you've taken as much as you can find, you'll have to make it back to the surface. Climb aboard your boat, offload your booty, then strap on a fresh oxygen tank and take to the waters once more. Simple really, but I have to say it's all tense stuff, as you swim as quickly as possible on the lookout for pearls, treasure chests and air refill stations. Bang your head on a rock and you lose what you're carrying, and returning to the boat to refill your oxygen is fine, but the boat doesn't stand still, it moves. Now, I would say that Scuba Dive is a difficult game. Level 1 is certainly the easiest level with fewer sharks and predatory fish, but if you get to level 4 then it is insanely jam-packed with deadly creatures. There's certainly that feeling whether it's possible to progress at all. It is a tall order, this game. However, in saying all that, I did find Scuba Dive oddly satisfying. I mean, getting out with some golden diamonds feels great as a result of how hard the game is. So, although there's a steep learning curve and luck is always a factor, I wouldn't let this put you off the game. So, let's have a look. Right, now we're on to the Commodore 64 version by N. Dudney. Now firstly, I need to say this right away, Scuba Dive in the Commodore 64 is a poor conversion. While the original ZX Spectrum is enjoyable and playable, this version is just a joke, dearie me. The first area is just a single screen, unlike the original where the surface was explorable over a number of screens. The sea creatures are blocky and look ridiculous. The graphics overall are pathetic, especially the scrolling, which makes the side panel judder when exploring the undersea caves. The gameplay is a pale imitation of the ZX Spectrum version. Anyway, let's have a look. Right, now we're onto the Oric game, which was written by Ronald Jeffs. That's the guy who wrote Harrier Attack on the Oric. It's a very different game from the well-known ZX Spectrum version. While the Speccy version feels like an arcade adventure, the Oric version feels more like a coin-op arcade game. The Oric game is a nice game, but in my opinion it's a little inferior to the Spectrum version, which was 48k, and the Oric is only 16k. But I have to say, I certainly think it's better and vastly superior to that Commodore 64 version. Right, next up is Dam Buster, which was released on computers Lynx and was written by Mike Richardson. Dam Buster, which was also released as Dam Busters, is a side-view single-screen game where you are a pilot from the 617 Squadron in World War II, where your mission is to destroy various dams using a bouncing bomb. Below the water is a green bar, which is the drop zone, and the bomb can only be released over this. A flak gun on the top of the dam and at the right side of the dam fire diagonally upwards, and you must avoid the flak and not hit the dam either, or you'll lose one of the 3 lives. Okay, so Lunar Landing, it was created by Mike Richardson and was a typing game that was published in the magazine ZX Computing issue 13 in June 1984. The game is an arcade action game that challenges the players to control a lunar lander and successfully navigate it to a safe landing. The objective of the game is to adjust the rocket thrust and use it to manoeuvre the lander, avoiding obstacles and landing safely on the moon's surface. The game is supposed to offer an opportunity for beginners to learn programming through its basic code structure. Next up is Combat Lynx, which is a real-time combat flight simulation game released in 1984 for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, with versions for the Amstrad CPC, BBC Micro and Electron following in 1985. So let's start by looking at the ZX Spectrum game, which was coded by Mike Richardson. The game puts players in control of a Westland Lynx helicopter, tasking them with defending bases and troops while destroying enemy forces. Interestingly, Durell developed Combat Lynx with the assistance from Westland Helicopters, the manufacturers of the real Lynx helicopter. In the game, players pilot a Lynx helicopter in a 3-dimensional randomly generated battlefield. Combat Lynx combines elements of flight simulation with strategic gameplay, requiring players to manage resources, defend bases, and engage the enemy on combat missions. It supports various control schemes, including 2 joysticks, joystick and keyboard, or keyboard only. There are nearly 30 control keys, most of which are redefinable. Players must manage multiple bases, supplying them with fuel, weapons and personal transporter from headquarters. The number of bases varies from 3 to 6, depending on the chosen skill level. Bases need to be defended from enemy attacks, and if all bases are overrun or all 3 helicopters are destroyed, then the game ends. Before missions, players can arm and equip their helicopter using an equipment menu. The game displays 3D wireframe plans of the Lynx, showing the selected items, their quantity and weight. Players must balance their load against the helicopter's maximum carrying capacity. A key strategic element is the intelligence map, which can be called up to show battlefield positions, including enemy concentrations, allied forces and land contours. The map is divided into grids and updates periodically, though enemy positions may move between updates. While viewing the map, the helicopter continues to move, requiring careful attention to avoid crashes. There are 4 skill levels affecting the number of bases, enemy vehicles and missile accuracy. Players receive an inefficiency rating, which depends on the number of bases destroyed, troops lost, allied vehicles lost, ammunition used and the number and value of targets hit. Scores are recorded on a high score table. So let's have a look at the game. Right, now let's have a look at the Commodore 64 version, which was coded by Ron Jeffs. This is the BBC Micro version, which was released in 1985. And finally, this is the 1985 Amstrad CPC version. Combat Lynx received generally favourable reviews from contemporary gaming magazines. Several reviewers noted the game's unique blend of action and strategy. Crash magazine wrote that the game can certainly be played like a shoot 'em up or as a game of stealthy strategy. The game's graphics and 3D representation were commended. Crash praised the innovative use of contour lines for 3D graphics, calling it more effective than an illusion of 3D. Amstrad computer user noted that the landscape comes in nicely from the distance and features on the ground get bigger and smaller with distance. However, your Spectrum criticised the screen redrawing mechanism when turning, describing it as strange and potentially disorientating. The complexity of the controls and the game's steep learning curve were points of contention among reviewers. Computer and video games noted that the controls are very complex, but not impossible to master, advising players to take time to read the comprehensive instructions. Sinclair users suggested the game might be too much of a simulation for some players, potentially tedious for arcade gamers due to the lack of immediate excitement. Despite the initial difficulty, some reviewers found the game rewarding once mastered. Amtech stated once you have mastered the controls, you can then start to enjoy Combat Lynx properly, praising its professional and polished look. Crash concluded that the game offered excellent value for money and would provide hours and hours of fun for strategy game enthusiasts. The Amstrad version was particularly well received, with Amtech declaring it the best compared to other computer versions of the game. So there you go. Right, next is Mineshaft, which was released in 1984 for the BBC Micro and the Acorn Electron, and it was done by Nick Wilson and Julian Todd. And your aim in this game is to collect all the lumps of coal in the 20 rooms of the mineshaft. You have to be quick, daring and sometimes near suicidal to accomplish your task, and beware, you only have a limited air supply. To collect the lumps of coal, you'll have to move and jump around the screen. Sometimes you must jump whilst also moving sideways. Now watch out for the disintegrating sludge, which disappears as you walk over it. Although it does disintegrate more slowly if you bounce along it. Now watch out for those obstacles that may kill you. And after completing each screen, you may move to the next through the door, or if you get stuck, you can press escape to make your exit. And this game, well, it's compatible with all the joysticks. Let's have a look at the game. Right, so Rollin' Goes Square Bashin'. It's an action game developed by Durell Software Ltd and published by Amsoft, which was released in Europe in 1984. It was only released on the Amstrad CPC. It's a logic puzzle game in the popular Rollin' game series. And in this game, Rollin' looks a rather little bit more square and squashed than usual, but he has a very square job to accomplish, as the goal of the game is to visit each square in the game area just a single time as they start to dissolve as soon as you step on them. So you have a short period of time to determine the path that will get you to every square, and then you have to do it with a quickness or go falling into space. It's an okay game, it's a pretty good challenge. Next up is Spacehawks, which was released on the Amstrad CPC in 1984 by Simon Francis. Spacehawks is a galactic shoot-'em-up in the style of Galaxian. And as in Galaxian, the player's spaceship can only move along the horizontal axis. When an alien is killed, the player must avoid the debris of the alien. And in the advanced levels, the player must be also very careful with the space mines that move around the game screen. There are 8 waves of aliens that must be destroyed to complete the adventure. Thankfully, before starting the game, the user can select the difficulty level, which is among the 8 levels, and the number of players, which can be 1 or 2. Now, by the time Clive Townsend wandered in, Durell was set up and running already as an established game software house. And having been promised a job upon leaving school, Townsend returned a few months later. His first task was to write a Spectrum version of an in-house game design. That game was Death Pit. Now, Death Pit was extensively advertised in 1985 by Durell, but was ultimately not considered good enough for release. An article in issue 25 of Crash magazine remarked, although halfway through the project there was a moment when it looked like the game might make a commercial release, it didn't come up to scratch. The prototype for Death Pit has been recovered and made available at World of Spectrum in 2007. Now, despite the dramatic artwork and name, Death Pit doesn't have much of a plot to speak of. Explore the mines, gather as much gold as possible, and the precious gem buried deep in the mine complex just behind the last of the dragons. As well as the dragons, you need to deal with spiders, bats and all manner of unknown creature, not to mention the unusual perils you expect to find in mineshafts like flooding, rough terrain. Okay, so Critical Mass, known as Power in North America, it's a video game developed by Simon Francis and published in 1985 for the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Let's have a look at the ZX Spectrum version first. Mankind has spread throughout the solar system into vast colonies which are under alien threat. The bad guys have antimatter machines capable of destroying the planet's power source. You must destroy these before they can reach critical mass. Your journey involves travelling primarily to the east in a hovering craft. It is rotated with left and right movements and accelerated with forward motion. Laser and shield strength are limited and monitored on screen. Use them wisely as hostile aliens and mines line the route. Get shot down and you re-emerge with a jetpack, now directed to the bay which can give you a new craft. The force field gates near the power plants are guarded by turrets, which must be shot down. The mission then boils down the insides of the planet, which must be destroyed before its tractor beam has sucked you into the core. And in the game, the player may control the movement of the hovercraft using a joystick, push him forward to accelerate and pull him back to decrease speed. Right, next up is the Commodore 64 game, which was done by Ron Jeffs. Right, now this is Shades, which was released in the Commodore 64 by Nigel Dewdney in 1985. A curse has fallen on the island of Ireland called Shades, and it causes people to vanish and reappear elsewhere. Whatever brought the curse also brought monsters and traps, making the island a dangerous place to be. You play a hero determined to find out the truth and rid the island of the curse, monsters and traps, and make the island the lovely place it used to be. You can attempt this quest solo, or you can allow 3 other players to attempt the quest as well, each taking it in turns at various points. There are also 3 skill levels which can be picked. And with regards to the gameplay, Shades is a flick screen arcade adventure where each screen is viewed from an elevated angle as you explore the island. You are armed with a sword or a crossbow, which can be found later, and as you move about the island, you can encounter many monsters who can either be avoided, fought or pleaded with, but if pleading fails, then you can fight or run away. On each screen are many traps, and you can search by pressing T, but be careful because if there are many traps, then not all will be revealed at first. Secret doors can be searched for by pressing E, and these are an important part to complete your quest. Fighting or hurting yourself on traps decreases a physical state bar, but if you can avoid battles, this can increase slowly if in the green section. Once the bar is empty, then it's game over for that player. Scattered around the island are chests containing various objects to help you in your quest. You can carry up to 8 items, and any items carried can be dropped or used in various locations to aid you on your quest. Objects cannot be dropped on the stairs or the moors as the winds would blow them away. Taking objects or fighting monsters increase your experience, and it is used as a high score at the end of the game. And as you explore the island, the Shades curse can hit you and transport you to an earlier location you've already visited. And of course, once all players are dead, then the game is over. While working on the doomed Spectrum Death Pit, Clive Townsend beavered away on another project in his spare time. Now as a kid, Clive was into his judo, karate and the jitsu, and this actually brought him to the idea of his next game. Townsend's core idea was to send his ninja hero into a James Bond style environment. Before he had finished Death Pit, he showed his game gloomily titled Ninja Darkness to Robert White. And Robert thought the game was good, but the scrolling was a little bit too slow. Robert told Clive to make it in flick screen instead. And this was a convenient way of solving the speed problem, as it only updated the bits it needed. So that's what Townsend done. So, Saboteur, it combines platform beat 'em up and stealth elements, setting you as a lone samurai trying to infiltrate an enemy complex. You are capable of all manner of ninja style moves, including kicks and punches, as well as using weaponry. You must travel through an underground complex, linked mainly by platforms and ladders, before triggering a bomb and escaping the complex. Your energy recharges if you stay still, so finding areas free of guards and dogs is useful, especially as you only have one life. There's plenty of object manipulation involved, although only one item can ever be carried at a time. Crash noted that the sound and the range of movements available and concluded it is one of the better releases on the Spectrum this year. Computer and Video Games said it was a winner. The game was also voted number 55 in the Your Sinclair official Top 100 Games of All Time. Okay, so we've just seen the ZX Spectrum version by Clive Townsend. Let's have a look at the Commodore 64, which was released in 1986 by a fella called Branko Spoljarek. Never heard of him. The game was also released in the Amstrad CPC in 1985, also done by Clive, so let's have a look at that. And also very unusually, it was released in the Commodore Plus 4 in 1986. So let's have a look at that version. Now the game was also followed by Saboteur 2, Avenging Angel in 1987, but we'll come on to that. There was also unofficial Saboteur games which were also created by fans, but we're not really going to cover that. And there was also an official Saboteur remake which was launched by Clive Townsend in December 2015, and this contains an extended map, plot and gameplay. The game can be played online and contains the original Spectrum and Commodore 64 gameplay and graphics. And also in 2017, Clive Townsend, in association with Realtek VR, released an enhanced version of Saboteur for the PC, iOS and Android devices. The game was also released in November 2018 for the Nintendo Switch, but we'll come on to that later. Alright, now we're looking at Deep Strike, which was done by Nick Wilson, and it was released on the Amstrad CPC, the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64. So let's start by looking at the ZX Spectrum version. So Deep Strike is set in World War II, and you form part of a squadron attempting a dangerous mission of destroying a Nazi fuel depot. Your fighter plane is armed with guns. A team of bombers are out there with you, with one always in front. Initially, you will face a few planes flying towards you. Red planes shoot at you, and later there are black suicidal planes, which aim to take you down kamikaze style, and then blue max planes, which are extra tough. After the first minute or so, another challenge is added, in the shape of hills to fly around or over. After this, you reach the bombing zone, in which you guide the bombers behind you, and instruct them which sites to bomb. The game is viewed from the cockpit, with displays telling you of how much damage you and the bomber have taken, and whether you are steering in the right direction. A map is also built in, which is helpful. Okay, so let's have a look at the Commodore 64 version, which is also done by Nick Wilson. And finally, let's have a look at the Amstrad CPC version. Fatworm Blows a Sparky is an action game written by Julian Todd for the ZX Spectrum. Now, Todd wrote the game in 5 months before he went off to university. It was not ported to other systems, and it's the only published game he developed. So, the game world is rendered with solid vector graphics. Fatworm is locked inside a Spectrum's architecture and is looking for a disk drive in order to produce a clone of himself. He moves around the arrangement of chips, processors and boards with the aim of finding his way through. Now, on the way he will encounter bugs which he must shoot at by blowing a Sparky, releasing a bolt of electrical energy. He can also use mines and impact shots which can also be fired. Now, contact with these bugs causes them to jump on you, gradually slowing your movement and sapping your energy, and you must collect spindles in order to get rid of them. Alright, so Thanatos is an action game developed and published in 1986 for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and the Amstrad CPC by Mike Richardson. So let's start by looking at the ZX Spectrum version first. Thanatos is a side-scrolling dragon action game with a dragon protagonist named Thanatos the Destroyer. Now look at that, eh? The large on-screen dragon was animated with a lot of detail on the head, wings and legs, and the background had a semi-3D parallax scrolling system, akin to the semi-3D system seen in other Durell games such as Fatworm and Combat Lynx. The game's title music, composed by Julian Breeze, is multi-channeled on the Spectrum single beat channel, using the same multi-channel engine as some other Durell titles too. And on the Spectrum 128K, the title music actually does have multiple channels. Anyway, in the game, the player must guide the dragon through the land flying towards the right and fight its way through a multitude of enemies, both humans and fantasy creatures such as sea snakes, giant spiders and a hostile two-headed dragon. They can be burned with the dragon's fiery breath, or they can be grabbed with the dragon's claws and dropped onto other enemies. Boulders can also be picked up and dropped on the enemies too. And to win the game, the dragon's mission is to pick up an enchantress for a ride, then safely deliver her to find a book of spells, and finally take her to a magic cauldron so she may cast her spell. The enchantress brings extra challenge to the task, as she must be kept safe from harm. And if Thanatos turns around too fast while flying, well, she'll fall off and she needs to be picked up again. If the sorceress is slain or Thanatos dies, the game will obviously end. Now, the dragon must make its way through a few strongholds whose gates must be burned through, because apparently the castle walls are too tall to fly over. And if the dragon runs out of fire breath, well, it must backtrack to find a virgin strapped to a pole so that he can eat her, because that's how he rolls. And eating the virgin, well, that'll restore the dragon's breath, so it's quite important to eat the virgin. However, you need to be wary, as a knight is waiting in ambush and attacks the dragon while it's landed and is vulnerable. So don't be eating any virgins when you've got a knight in front of you. Now, the dragon's health is indicated by a beating heart in the bottom of the screen. As the dragon takes hits from the enemies, the heart starts beating faster and faster, and near death it starts flashing blue. So the dragon must withdraw to safety to rest and recover. So let's have a little bit more of a look at the ZX Spectrum version. Alright, now we're on to the Amstrad CPC version. Let's have a look at that game. And finally, here's the Commodore 64 version. Now, Thanatos was critically acclaimed. The ZX Spectrum version was Popular Computing Weekly's Pick of the Week, and it received a Crash Smash accolade from Crash magazine. Not to mention a Mega Game Award from your Sinclair. It also got 4 out of 5 stars from Sinclair User, and also 8 out of 10 from Computer and Video Games. Pretty good. And the size of the protagonist was highlighted in these reviews, the dragon sprite taking up a third of the length of the display. On the animation of the dragon, Jim Douglas commented that the graphics really come into their own when you see the dragon flying over the landscape. The wings flap with superbly convincing swooshing sound effects, and the dragon waves his head around too. Crash opined the movement of the main dragon is very smooth and realistic, and Computer and Video Games found Thanatos is a big, nicely animated character who performs neat turns and landings on request. The parallax scrolling background was also praised, as was the overall atmosphere and satisfaction of controlling this vicious creature. There were minor criticisms though. Crash felt that Thanatos was a little too hard, and PCW concluded I'm not 100% sure that it would keep you hooked for weeks on end. But for me, I thought it was a good game. Now, we all know that Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto has become such a behemoth. It seems strange the series started out life as an unexpected smash. Driving around the cities in that first top-down crime caper was thrilling and liberating. There was no being forced down dingy first-person corridors here, and you could gleefully ignore the game's missions and enjoy exploring causing mayhem in the sprawling urban environment. GTA was often cited as refreshingly original in the game's press of the time, yet those of us who had been playing on our ZX Spectrums many years earlier thought it all played a little familiar to a multi-city adventure by the name of Turbo Esprit. But the miracle of Turbo Esprit is not just its innovative gameplay, but the way it presents a real and suitably grim 80s urban landscape for the player to drive around, all within a mere 48k of memory. Traffic lights operate with annoying frequency, pedestrians stroll around, seemingly oblivious to the speeding cars that charge down the narrow streets, and stark angular buildings enshroud every screen. The player, assuming control of the sports car, can either take on the drug dealers or buzz around the city, obeying or disobeying the highway code to the heart's content. Now, does that sound familiar? Now, this freedom to make this choice was rarely seen in 1986. Robert White says, "I wanted a game where you could drive around a city in real time, with a fantasy of James Bond-like machine guns to blow away the bad guys." So Robert took the concept to make skyscrapers in a way that the whole city block could rapidly be drawn from a surprisingly compact database. And with Robert's experience as a CAD specialist for the Oxford Regional Health Authority, which used an integrated computer modelling system to design its hospitals, White fostered the concept of an urban landscape with the player free to move around within its confines. Absolute genius. Now, in Turbo Esprit, you are a special agent trying to prevent a gang of drug smugglers from completing drug deliveries using your high-tech Lotus Esprit. You can either track down and destroy the cars or ram them until they no longer function. You basically travel around 4 cities and find the evil drug lords. HQ also helps by keeping you up to date on an armoured car targeted by the baddies on your map. Stop them before they transfer the drugs and then flee to a new city, but be careful, they are sneaky and may be using duplicate courier cars. Upon loading the game, there's a choice of 4 cities to choose from: Wellington, Gainsborough, Minster and Romford. Romford? Mike called one of the cities Wellington because that's where he lived in Somerset. Perhaps the other city, Gainsborough, was called that way because it had the word game in it, and maybe Romford because it had Rom in it. Who knows, but Minster, no idea. However, regardless, because of the limitation of the way the maps were completely stored, designing anything based on real towns was an impossibility, so anyone hoping to spot their street in a suburban Romford is perhaps going to be a little bit disappointed. By 1986, Turbo Esprit was ready, at least on the home ZX Spectrum version. The game was critically acclaimed upon release. Reviewers appreciated the technical achievement welded to an unusual gameplay. Sales as a solo release and part of a 4-game compilation were sold, and a decent Amstrad CPC conversion appeared shortly afterwards. Sadly, on the Commodore 64 computer, things fell apart dramatically, and the game was deemed unworthy of release. And despite the success of the Spectrum version, Robert White wasn't particularly compelled to even consider a sequel. Looking back today, it's easy to trace a line that slices through Turbo Esprit and continues on through Grand Theft Auto and beyond. If nothing else, for the idea of freely driving a vehicle around an open city, engaging in the game's plot and missions as you see fit. It's brilliant. And for Turbo Esprit's sole programmer, the talented Mike Richardson, it remains his favourite of a very impressive roster of games. Well done, Mike, well done. 1986 also saw the release of Durell Big 4, which is a compilation of 4 games from Durell Software. The games included Combat Lynx, Critical Mass, Saboteur and Turbo Esprit. And this was released on the ZX Spectrum, the Commodore 64 and the Amstrad CPC. And then in 1987 they released Chain Reaction. The anti-nuclear party are up to their old tricks again. They have decided to infiltrate a nuclear power station and program the robots to empty the containment vault and attack all scientists inside it. To make matters worse, the entire facility will self-destruct in 50 minutes. As one of the scientists that survived the onslaught, the player must prevent this from happening by collecting 18 fuel canisters scattered around all 7 floors of the facility and disposing them in the pit that lies at the centre of the first floor, but only 1 canister can be carried at a time. And if the player comes in contact with any of the robots, their radiation level increases. Once the player becomes totally contaminated, they will die. Thankfully, there are decontamination shards around the facility, and entering them reduces their radiation level. In the game, the players are equipped with a jetpack that can be used to fly over dangerous areas. Let's have a look at the ZX Spectrum game. And finally, this is the Amstrad CPC game. Saboteur 2 Avenging Angel, also known as Saboteur 2, is an action-adventure game created by Clive Townsend. It was released by Durell Software in 1987 for the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and MS-DOS compatible operating systems. A sequel to 1985's Saboteur, it was one of the first action-adventure games with a female protagonist and was well received by critics. I mean, it was at the time when it was all Tomb Raiders and what have you. Now, the ninja hero of the original Saboteur game has been killed, and his sister Nina is out to avenge this injustice. She has an array of kung fu moves on offer and must put them to use through 700 screens of action. The game design is very similar to the original, right down to the unusual background graphical style. The sections of the game are on multiple levels, separated mainly by ladders and with lots of weapons and ammunition to pick up along the way. And to beat the game, you'll have to collect tapes and collect a 14-part computer code. And as I said, Saboteur 2 was one of the first action-adventure games with a female protagonist. Now, for a serious game released in 1987, that was kind of a big deal, especially when she wasn't a princess or cartoon character. She was a ninja. The game's designer Clive Townsend said it was a conscious decision. I wanted something original and it seemed quite different to most other games. It's become acceptable now after Tomb Raider, but at the time it was a bit strange. I mean, why shouldn't ninja characters be female? Nevertheless though, the PC version features a male ninja on the cover. Apparently, Townsend traced the character art for the game's loading screen from an erotic magazine. Ooh, her. And Saboteur 2 itself was supposed to be followed by a cancelled Saboteur 3D for the ZX Spectrum, which would feature isometric perspective graphics. Despite the 4 release formats being different in hardware and programming, the different versions all looked and played almost identical. Usually it's almost impossible to tell the difference between the Amstrad CPC, the PC and the Commodore 64 versions, although the colour clash in the ZX Spectrum is a bit of a giveaway. The game was re-released by Hitpack in 1988 and by Encore in 1989. It was also released as a bonus with an issue of Zap 64 in 1993. Initial reviews of the game were positive. For instance, Phil South from Your Sinclair said the game's a fine sequel, but possibly more important, it's a fine game in its own right. Saboteur was an original twist on an old platform riff, so that makes Sab 2 a double twist with a backflip and a larger chaser. And when the game was re-released in 1989, your Sinclair's Marcus Berkman wrote that if it doesn't perhaps hold up too well now, it's still an entertaining enough chase and kick 'em up with the novelty of a female hero. Okay, this is the Amstrad CPC game, very similar to the ZX Spectrum. Here's the Commodore 64 version. Finally, here's the MS-DOS version. Okay, so 1987 saw the release of Sigma 7, which was released on the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC. The space station Sigma 7 has a problem. All robots have gone havoc. Now the player has to set things right by using the central controls inside the station. But of course it is not that easy. He first has to solve 3 levels with different gameplay mechanics. The first is a diagonally scrolling shooter which plays very basic, don't get hit by the mines which come in formations of 3. It is best to shoot them however, because surviving mines may come back from the side, which is deadly. After reaching the station, the game becomes a Pac-Man variant. In a maze-like field, the players need to pick up glowing balls on the floor without being touched by the enemies. But there are 2 important differences. The player controls a tank, i.e. he can shoot the foes and he doesn't have to pick up the balls. If he got enough, he can simply use the exit. However, a few balls can't be picked up and the pattern needs to be remembered. During the last minigame, the player gets presented with a panel of buttons. He bounces a ball on those buttons to recreate the pattern from before. He needs to look after a force field which follows the ball's movements. Touching it results in losing a life. The buttons also flash in different colours and the bouncing only gets registered when the right colour is active. After finishing this level, the game loops with faster enemies. So let's continue by looking at the ZX Spectrum game. Okay, this is the Commodore 64 version. And finally, this is the Amstrad CPC version. Now, sadly, Durell Software felt that the games market was becoming too risky by 1987. And towards the end of 1987, Durell Software sold the rights to publish most of their existing games to Elite Systems. And in 1988, Elite released a top 10 collection box. A collection of 10 games from both Durell and Elite. From here on, Durell Software changed their business focus to developing financial services software for the IFA, insurance and mortgage broking industries. Currently over 1,000 advisors and brokers use Durell Software today. However, they did produce one last game in 1989, and that game was Spitfire. And here you are a Spitfire pilot and you have been tasked to fly your plane across the English Channel and destroy any flying bombs on the ground and any enemy planes in the area. You also have to defend your base in England by shooting any flying bombs flying in the air towards your base. All this has to be done before your fuel runs out and you crash. You have 6 Spitfires to use, but you can lose some if they are destroyed at your base. And as you can see, the game is a horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, with the screen scrolling left to right or right to left if you turn your plane. The game also scrolls upwards and downwards if you climb or lower your plane. And your plane can take 10 hits before crashing, or you fly downwards too fast and you hit the ground. So let's continue by looking at the ZX Spectrum version. And then finally, there was a Commodore 64 version released in 1989 by Ron Jeffs. Now, technically there was another game, and that was Operation Hormuz. However, it was only written by Durell. The game was actually developed by Again and published by Alternative Software. I suppose Durell being the author, it was worth mentioning though. The game was released on the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST and the MS-DOS in 1989. And so, this is where our story is coming to an end. But before I go, whatever happened to those talented people at Durell? Well, for a start, in 2005, Mike Richardson founded Durell Games Limited. And they're currently focused on developing PC games for the internet download. And over the years, well, Mike, he's worked on titles for Electronic Arts, Eidos, Vivendi, the BBC and other game publishers. The first game to be developed by the company was Harrier Attack, a sequel to their first best-selling 8-bit game, but it did not repeat its predecessor's success, I have to tell you. You don't see much of Mike these days. I mean, he is an older fella after all, but you still see him occasionally in the odd convention here and there. Great fella though, he produced some really excellent games here. Now, Clive Townsend, well, he's still active. Today he's busy updating his legendary 8-bit games for modern platforms, including the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 5 and Spectrum Next. And I believe he's also working on official follow-ups. And it's certainly clear that Saboteur's popularity has not dimmed over the last, almost 40 years? And both Saboteur and Saboteur 2 Avenging Angel came out in 2018 and 2019. All of which were released on the Nintendo Switch, Windows and the PlayStation 4. Let's have a look at both of those games. And then in 2023, Saboteur Next, the remastered and improved version of the original Saboteur for the ZX Spectrum, was released on the ZX Spectrum Next. Let's have a look at both of those games. And then finally, what happened to Robert and his wife Veronica? Well, rather unusually, Durell still exists. They now make administration and accounting software for independent financial advisors. They now trade under the name Durell Solutions. And despite the fact that the company no longer makes video games, it's still very good to see that the company is still alive and kicking. So there you go, folks. That was my video covering all the history of Durell Software Ltd. Durell, they certainly made one of the most innovative games of the 8-bit era. And making this video, well, it certainly brought back the nostalgic memories of my teenager years. I enjoyed making this video and I hope you found it enjoyable too. Thank you so much everybody for taking the time to watch this lengthy video. It certainly took a lot of time to prepare and put together. I hope it was worth it, I really do. Now, remember to please press that like button, share my video, and please leave your comments. Share your thoughts and experiences. I'm particularly interested if you have any stories or experiences about Durell Software. Share them, I'm really interested. And finally, don't forget to press that subscribe button. That would be great and very much appreciated. So, until the next time, take care of yourselves. See you all very soon. Bye bye.